There's names we think of when it comes to the greatest songwriters of all time. If you brought up the topic at a party, you'd probably hear the likes of Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Brian Wilson, or Prince. But seldom to the everyman would you hear the name of one man, my all-time favourite storyteller, and the man with the most enticing, gravelly voice of all time. I think it would be fair to say that to call this piece a passion project would be an understatement. It feels with an oversaturated market, it's hard these days to find music that's worth your attention, or at least it's hard to find some that can keep it. From the boy bands to the highly produced and polished pop music that rests upon the top of the charts, sometimes it's nice to take a break from the synthetic and listen to something that makes you understand you are real. You could be driving to work listening to this music and yet somehow still feel as if you're in a bar that only exists for the purpose of this song. I think we're going to be here for a little while because I know I'd hate myself if I didn't do this one properly. So we best get started. Therefore, I present to you Tom Waits, the documentary. Tom once described himself as being born at a very young age. This fearful event, of which we would not be here without, happened in Pomona, California, on a December day in 1949. He was born to his mother, Alma Fair McMurray, and his father, Jesse Frank James. He once said that his father was named after outlaw brothers Jesse and Frank James, but I can't work out if this is a joke or not. He's always been a private man, so it's hard to know a lot about his childhood, and the amount of different stories he tells, it's hard to distinguish the fact from the fiction. Both his mother and father were teachers, but when Tom reached the age of 10, they divorced. He was once quoted saying, "I guess most entertainers are, on a certain level, part of the freak show. And most of them have this kind of wounding early on, either a death in the family or a breakup of the family unit, and it sends them off on some journey where they find themselves kneeling by a jukebox praying to Ray Charles. Or you're out looking for your dad, who left the family when you were 9, and you know he drives a station wagon, and that's all you've got to go on. And in some way, you're going to be a big sensation and be on the cover of Life magazine, and it'll somehow be this cathartic vindication or restitution." Tom lived what was a middle-class upbringing and a pretty normal childhood by the sound of things. He would go on to attend O'Farrell Community School, where he'd play in a band known as The Systems, described as white kids trying to get that Motown sound. Now, it's easy when listening to the array of music Tom has released to hear his influences. He once stated, when talking about high school, that he had a real interest in that James Brown and the Flames, but he also wrote Bob Dylan transcripts upon his bedroom wall. Now, you see, this was around about the same time as hippie culture broke out, but rejecting hippie culture, Tom found himself being obsessed with the Beat Generation. I'll give a quick rundown of the Beat Generation and what the movement was. So, the Beat Generation was a literary movement. It was spearheaded by the great minds of Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William S. Burroughs. I guess, to be frank about the subject, it was focused upon liberation, and it discussed topics such as rejection of materialism, taking drugs, and sexuality. There is a lot more to it, of course, but I feel like describing it that way is definitely a way to entice people into looking into it for themselves. If you are interested, I would recommend starting with reading Jack Kerouac's On the Road and working your way through it from there. So due to the Beat Generation, Tom talked of how he became curious of San Francisco, and when he went up there, he would go to the City Lights bookstore and the bars he knew Jack Kerouac frequented from his books to try and find him. And by the age of 18, he dropped out of high school. He worked in a pizza restaurant and would go to a local diner and write down the conversations he overheard. Tom claims he worked for 3 years in a forestry service, where he was taught how to bury himself in case of a fire so it'd burn over him. He claims he never had to use it, but when the day comes, he'll be ready. Now, the place we have to thank for the nurturing of Tom Waits' talent is a small folk club known as The Heritage in San Diego, of which he was originally the doorman. He stated that he worked his way up, playing a little guitar, playing a little piano, until finally one day he heard a local man on stage singing his own songs. After hearing this, he said that he knew that he wanted to live or die on the strength of his own music. This is where the conversations he wrote come into play. He said when he put them together, there was some hidden music in there. Using these conversations in this club, The Heritage, led to the first performances of his now famous works, all 55, and I Hope That I Don't Fall in Love With You. Exhausting his options to grow within San Diego, and with a growing reputation, Tom would flee to Los Angeles to play at the Troubadour. Waits would perform shows in the Troubadour, and by doing this is how he met David Geffen, the owner of Asylum Records, who would also go on to co-found DreamWorks. He would offer Tom Waits a recording contract, and this would give birth to the first ever Tom Waits album, Closing Time. This album features a majority of his most popular songs, and I'd describe it as his most accessible. It didn't receive major recognition, but received positive reviews where it did. It's said that Waits wanted the album to be more of a piano-led jazz album, but ended up being put in parallel with what was popular at the time, and was therefore more of a folk one. Now, an interesting thing that Tom would partake in before the release of his second album was attending something known as the Venice Poetry Club. This is where he would read out his lyrics as poetry, and use this as a platform to work out and practice his new song lyrics, working out how they should go. Through using this technique is how he came to decide upon songs such as Diamonds on the Windshield, which would feature on his new album, The Heart of Saturday Night, with the title song being written as a tribute to the previously mentioned Jack Kerouac. This album itself was written about American nightlife. Tom himself would later comment upon this album, calling it very ill-informed, but he was trying. However, the album did gain a lot more sales and was more widely received than Closing Time, showing Tom's growth. Waits' next album was titled Nighthawks at the Diner and was released in 1975. The title took inspiration from Edward Hopper's 1942 painting, Nighthawks. The album was recorded in front of a small audience in the Los Angeles record plant. The reason for this was to emulate the setting of a club and a live performance. The album received critical acclaim and was even featured on the Billboard Top 200. Throughout 1976, he toured the US and stated the experience was tough and he was drinking too much alcohol. He then moved into the Tropicana Hotel with his friend Chucky Wise. According to reports, his 2-room apartment was heavily cluttered. Referring to this time in the Tropicana Hotel, Tom is quoted saying, "You almost have to create situations in order to write about them, so I live in a constant state of self-imposed poverty." In the same year, 1976, Tom would release the album Small Change. This is a milestone in Tom's career. He stated when releasing this album, this is when he became completely confident in the craft. Once again, the album was critically well received, but this time he made it onto the Billboard Top 100. He started to grow in fame, being profiled by publications such as The New Yorker, Vogue and Time magazine. This is when his cult following started to appear. I feel like this is a fitting time to end part 1 of the documentary on Tom Waits. It has ended at a nice point in his career where he has grown to a certain level of fame, and in the next one we will chronological where he went from there on. I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.